Thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion with our authors and editors of the book, The Ones Who Remember. And I also want to thank you. If it's your first time being here at the museum, thank you for joining us. My name is Erin Blankenship, and I have the privilege of being the interim executive director here at the Florida Holocaust Museum, and I'm happy to meet you all. We're excited to welcome you back for in-person events this season, so thank you so much for coming. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our next event, which is in a couple weeks on October 27th, when we'll host author and comedian David Baddiel for our annual Rappaport Family Anti-Semitism Lecture. If you're not familiar with David Baddiel, he is a renowned British comedian and an author of children's books and a new book or newish book called Jews Don't Count, where he discusses anti-Semitism and why it is left out of so many contemporary discussions on racism and other forms of hatred. So I would encourage you to RSVP for that one on our website because we're thinking it'll fill up. So check it out on our website, which is thefhm.org. And before I introduce our panel, I want to thank Miranda Brenner, our community partnership and events manager, for organizing this event, as well as David Myers and Brett Hendrickson and Amy Baruch for managing our technology, because this is a unique event where we are bringing in one of our speakers live from Michigan. So thank you all for helping out. And of course, our visitor services manager, Brendan Redman, who's sitting over here. And we have books available. So I hope that after we're all done, you'll take a minute and purchase a book. And I'm sure Ruth and Dr. Benn will sign them for you. And I would be remiss in not mentioning our wonderful volunteer, Ted Glatt, for helping out tonight. Volunteers are the lifeblood of this museum, so we appreciate you. And so now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, I want to introduce Dr. Rita Benn. She is a clinical psychologist and adjunct faculty at the University of Michigan. Her academic career focused on developing statewide early intervention policies and educational programs in integrative medicine. More recently, she established several local nonprofits to advance the practice of mindfulness and teaches mindfulness meditation to educators, healthcare professionals, and families coping with cancer. Dr. Benn and her husband, Steve, both originally from Montreal, have 3 children and 3 grandchildren.
4 grandchildren.
Oh, well, congratulations, because that's fairly new since this is published fairly recently. And in her spare time, she enjoys painting, writing poetry, and practicing yoga. Joining us online is Dr. Joy Wolfe Ensor. She is a psychologist whose clinical teaching and leadership activities over 40 plus years have centered on social determinants of health and the multi-generational legacy of trauma. She grew up in New York City and has lived in Ann Arbor since 1973. This writing project has deepened her attachment to Krakow, her ancestral home. Joy and her husband, Doug, a fellow psychologist, have 2 daughters and 1 granddaughter. Yes. Joy has studied classical piano since age 6 and still tackles pieces that are a stretch for her little fingers to play. And our very own Ruth Wade. Ruth is a retired training and development executive. She currently teaches mobility and strengthening fitness and volunteers at the Florida Holocaust Museum as a speaker and docent. Thank you. Ruth also assists her Holocaust survivor father, Sidney Finkel, with the management of his speaking engagements and book Sevek and the Holocaust, The Boy Who Refused to Die. She grew up in Chicago, spent more than 20 years living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and now lives in Largo, Florida. Ruth's son, Ike, is a data scientist with a degree from the University of Michigan. So very proud. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our authors, and they will all discuss their work in the book and, of course, the whole process of writing this book. Thank you. Start out here.
Okay. Thanks, Erin. I'm thrilled to see everybody here tonight. Thanks for being here. And I have to say that Those of you who are children of survivors understand that we've inherited this gift of resilience from our parents, each and every one of us. And that really has come in handy when it came to this program, because 2 weeks ago there were going to be 4 authors here. And due to circumstances beyond our control, one is not with us and one is here. Thank goodness for the technology. Joy is here with us on Zoom. So we were able to flex and be resilient. And thank you to our parents once again for that gift. The book, The Ones Who Remember, includes 16 authors, and we're a community. We all have known each other for a long time. In 2004, we were tasked with creating original Yom HaShoah Holocaust remembrance services for Temple Beth Emmet in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then we're asked to do the part of the afternoon service on Yom Kippur. And in the process of creating and leading those services, we used a lot of our parents' stories as narratives in that. And over time, we became closer, and several of us said, we should really make a book of these narratives that we've used, of our parents' stories. And as we began that process, I guess I get to say 8 years ago now. It was a while ago that we started. We began to get feedback from some publishers who said, and also one of the survivors that's in our group, Irene Butter, who said to us, well, where's your voice in this? I don't hear you. And so we were kind of shocked that, anybody would want to hear our voices. And we had some decisions that we had to make because of that. The first one being, our parents survived the Holocaust, and they were resilient, and there were many gifts, but it wasn't a happily ever after story necessarily. And so in growing up with our survivor parents, not everything was great, because they were, they suffered this great trauma. And there was this feeling that we would be betraying them, and even when most of our parents had already passed. There are 2 people in our group who still have living parents. I'm one of them. So we had to deal with that idea of, if we share the ugly or the not so pretty, with the other side, how does that feel? That doesn't necessarily feel good. The other piece of it, and I know that I know there's lots of my 2G friends here today, second generation people, is this idea of, who cares about our struggles? How is that significant? Our parents went through this most horrific thing. And why would anyone care about what we went through? So we had to really talk about that a lot, and people seemed to be interested in understanding. And also, as far as the legacy goes, if we're going to continue, because so many of the survivors are passing away, and this Holocaust education is so important, and if we're going to take this on, we can't really tell their stories from unless we tell them through our own intergenerational point of view. So we came to this understanding that we can honor that there's no way we could ever, our struggles could ever compare with theirs. But yet there are people out there who maybe want or need to hear stories, and not even just Holocaust survivors, but hear these stories of what it's like to grow up with parents and families that have been through trauma. And so we thought, okay, we'll go forward. We'll give that a try and dig deeper. That was one of our things we said a lot was, can we dig deeper? So we began to move forward, and there were many surprises for us in doing so. We came to have a deeper understanding of our parents by writing about this and writing in our voices, what it was like, why our parents parented the way that they did. And it really helped us to understand what that was like and why that was growing up. And that was really helpful, and to understand, what their gifts were that they gave us and what the challenges were that they had. And it gave us this deeper understanding so that those of us who needed to heal, and sometimes we didn't even know that we really needed to heal, but we explored that idea and began to do that healing. And it improved our relationships in interesting ways. Certainly, it improved my relationship with my father tremendously. But also people in our group with some of their siblings, and with other people, the connections became stronger, and because the more understanding was there. And we were also able to connect with people who weren't Jewish or weren't Holocaust survivors, but were people who, had grown up with any kind of trauma in their families and their lives. So that was a great surprise, a delightful surprise for us as well. So this is our way of, creating a legacy. And as much as I love Florida, there are things here that are scary right now. And, anti-Semitism is on the rise, not just here, but in particular in this area. And, the museum does such a fantastic job of fighting that and educating people and helping with that. And it's an honor to be associated with the museum in doing so. And the book is our way also of doing that. It's our contribution that we can make to help people understand the Holocaust and, why anti-Semitism and why it's important to fight that and not be a bystander. So we're hoping that, through our work that we can help educate, we can help people find hope, and help them with their own healing and their relationships. And thank you so much for being here. We're going to read some excerpts from our book for you, and we're going to start though with Rita's going to read a poem by one of our authors who's no longer with us, and then we'll go to Joy, who is on Zoom with us. We'll read an excerpt, then Rita, and then I'll close it out. So
this poem is by Myra Fox, and she was going to be one of the editors or co-editors with us of our book, but died of cancer within several months, about 4 years ago. And it's called, this poem is It Essential? I wake in the night and curse yet one more time that what my own mom told me is true. Once you're a mother, the worry never ceases. But my son lives in a liberal paradise, a city of beauty and of tolerance. He is working long hours, enjoying praise for his creativity and skills, arriving home tired, enjoying time in the company of friends, and he is so happy, it seems. He gets bits of information from friends and coworkers, no time to read the newspaper between jobs, no time to focus on the madness. And I wonder, is it truly essential that he recognize the trouble we're in? That he too lay terrified in the night? That he worry about who will next be impoverished, imprisoned, openly mocked and hated, deprived of the most basic human rights, exterminated? He has already listened to the stories his grandparents have shared, and he already heard my retellings. Ghettos, concentration camps, hunger, torture, loss. He knows why our family's so small. So please, can't I instead remind him of the lullabies I sang to soothe him to sleep? Remind him of Rosinski's Mit Madeleine Dam Aleph Bass? Is it essential? Is it truly essential? I mourn the reality that the unlikely miracle of my parents' survival, that the unlikely birth of my sister, brother, and myself make it so.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you especially to the museum staff for making it possible for me to come in. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to my background and then read an excerpt from my chapter. My parents are from Krakow, Poland. They met and married during the war and were together in the Krakow ghetto and the Płaszów slave labor camp before they were separated and sent to different camps. They reunited in September 1945, a whole saga of its own that you can read more about in our book. And they spent 2 years in Sweden before immigrating to the US in 1948. I'm going to read an excerpt from the very beginning and very end of my chapter. There was barely enough room to hold all the memorial candles that my parents lit every Yisker. The tiny galley kitchen in our New York City apartment was short of counter space, and the bookshelves were not flame-proof. So the candles were arrayed on a rolling Sultan hot table tucked in the hallway outside my bedroom. There was a candle for each of my grandmothers, another 2 for my grandfathers, and 1 more for everyone else, including 9 of my father's 10 brothers and sisters and almost all of their offspring, the sweet children of the family. The candles flickered through the night, casting shadows that danced on the walls and ceiling just outside my bedroom door. Those flickers and shadows terrified me as a child. I dreaded having to cross their path to go from my room to the bathroom. I would hold off as long as I could, and then, covering my eyes and crouching low, skitter past the candles as quickly as I could, lest the ghosts in the flickers grab me. It never occurred to me to ask my parents to roll the hot table to a different location. I never told them I was frightened. I knew from my father's burning eyes and my mother's overflowing ones that the candles signified something terrible. Both my parents seemed to retreat into a dark and distant place until the last of the candles flickered out. I couldn't grasp the enormity of their losses, but I imagined that somehow the dead lingered in those shadows. What's a mother to do with the ghosts in the nursery? How does she bind up her own pain enough to pass the family legacy on to the next generation? When the time comes for her to explain to her children that they were named for murdered loved ones, how does she tell that story? In 1943, in the midst of the horror and degradation of the Skarżysko slave labor camp, my 22-year-old mother wrote a defiant line. My name is number 906, and guess what? I still write verse. Henya Carmel and her sister Ilona had already endured the terror of the Nazi invasion. Their family had fled Krakow for the east, but after their father was captured and deported to his death, they decided they were better off returning to the relative safety and community of the Krakow ghetto. From there, my mother, aunt, and grandmother were enslaved in Płaszów, Skarżysko, and Buchenwald. Along with the other prisoners, they were starved and beaten. They fell ill with typhoid and typhus. They watched as loved ones were taken off to their deaths. Their survival depended on contributing to the German war effort. Working under horrific conditions, they stuffed munitions with poisonous picric acid that infiltrated their lungs and yellowed their skin. And yet, through all of this, Henya and Ilona wrote poetry on sheets of paper smuggled into the barracks from the slave labor factory. In the progressive Jewish academy they had attended until the outbreak of World War II, the sisters had studied Polish, learning Adam Mickiewicz's classical romantic verses and Julian Tuwim's experimental poetic forms. They loved Poland and her literature, even though my mother lamented Poland never loved them back. Since losing my mother, I have had many occasions to light memorial candles, as is our lot as we grow older. Today, I no longer fear the flickering lights and dancing shadows. Rather, I find them beautiful and comforting. They still hold ghosts, but of people I knew and cherished, who loved and cherished me back. When I light the candles with my family members, we share stories and remembrances. And if I walk by the candles at night, I greet my beloveds. I tell them how blessed I am to be here to honor their memory and to know that their good names are carried on through the generations after. Thank you.
My parents were from Eastern Europe. My mother was born in Odessa and my father in Moscow. And then their families moved to Vilnius in Lithuania. And right before, a couple of years before the war broke out, they were in college in Brussels, studying at the University of Liège. And in 1940, when the war broke out, their parents did not want them to come home, but they wanted to come back and be with their parents. And when they did that, then they were stuck and they couldn't get out. They were in the Kovno ghetto for close to 4 years, and they were hiding in a bunker. And 3 of the family members, my mother, my father, and my mother's mother, were discovered and were then taken on the last transport out of Kovno to the concentration camps. My father went to Dachau and my mother to Stutthof. And after the war, miraculously, my parents found each other. They had gotten married during ghetto, and they found each other. Of the 33 kind of family members of uncles and aunts and grandparents, only my father and my mother's sister survived the war. The day I closed up my mother's apartment, I arranged for most of her personal and treasured belongings to be given away. The larger items that my brother and I loved were shipped to our houses. As I closed the door to leave for this last time, all that I carried out of hers fit into one suitcase. How strange and how sad, I thought, that what remained of a life could be held just in one suitcase. What I've come to appreciate now is how much of my mother's life could not neatly be packed away or confined into one piece of baggage, that she continues to live within and outside of me. Our mother-daughter relationship has not stopped with her death. Growing up, I never perceived my mother to be independent and resourceful. I didn't realize all the risks she took in her life. My mother always downplayed what she had done to save her little cousin Tanya's life by escaping from the ghetto one night to save the 3-year-old from kinder action. In a matter-of-fact tone, my mother said, "It's what you do for family." But really, the bravery she demonstrated was extraordinary, and the humility with which she spoke about it was amazing. In April 1945, Russian bombs began hitting Stutthof, mistaking it for a military camp. The Nazis marched my mother and the other inmates to a shipping port, crowded them onto the lower deck of a ship, and set them out from shore. From the ship, the Germans began shooting at the British liberators stationed on the land. The inmates on the boat started to scramble amidst the gunfire, and my mother jumped off the boat, even though she didn't know how to swim. Somehow she made her way to the shore, wading through waters red with blood. She was interned in a Soviet transit camp in Germany, where she learned that my father had been seen alive in a German hospital a couple of weeks earlier. Having no choice but to board the train going back to Lithuania, she decided to jump off of it when it slowed down through the town. As she wandered through the countryside by herself, she was falsely arrested as a German spy. With no identification papers to prove otherwise, my mother spent the next few days in jails while the police verified her identity with the displacement authorities. When they released her, the police helped her to find the train to Loach, where she was given temporary housing. My father received news of her location somehow, and miraculously one day they were reunited. In 1953, 7 months pregnant with me, my mother traversed the Atlantic by boat with my brother, then 4 years old, to join my father, who was already in Montreal working. Emigrating to a new country without close friends or relatives, and unfamiliar with the English language or culture, she found her way, creating a close-knit group of Eastern European survivor friends and a few select Canadians in the mix. At age 51, after 16 years as a homemaker, she was left widowed, the only singleton amongst her friends. With more than sufficient financial resources left from my father, she took it upon herself to learn how to manage the investments. She sold and moved from our split-level home to an apartment, which she furnished anew with antiques and art she collected. And after her first bout with cancer derailed her dreams in her early 60s, my mother picked herself up and bought her first place of real estate, a beach condominium in South Florida, where until the age of 82 she lived part-time as a snowbird, managing its yearly rental from afar to offset the cost. I feel blessed to see my mother differently now, as a woman filled with grit and determination, independent of me and of what I did or did not do for her as a child. I see her agility and resilience, her devotion to doing her best to mother myself and my brother, and to show us her love. My mother fought a courageous battle to rise above the pain of loss she endured and the extra suffering she brought upon herself. Yes, she had shadows on her journey. We each do. I feel only the utmost respect, gratitude, and compassion for her.
Forgiveness. It often comes up with our Generations After groups, and we have a wide spectrum of perspectives about it. You know, can you forgive the Germans, the Nazis, the Lithuanians? But in my context of forgiveness, it's more inward than it is outward. My father was only 8 years old when the war began, living in Piotrków Trybunalski, central Poland. He was 13. He was 8 when they went into the ghetto. He was 13 when he was in Buchenwald, Death March, cattle car, open cattle car for 3 weeks, and then typhus and liberated in Theresienstadt. Dehumanized for 5 years as a child. His survival tactic his main one was numbing his emotions and suppressing his desire to love. The passage I'm going to read about is about his final encounter with his father, who he met in Buchenwald right before his father was then sent to Dora Mittelbau, another concentration camp that was an underground ammunition plant, and that's where his father died. His father offered him a piece of bread and a hug, and my father was so dehumanized at that point, he took the bread, but all he could really do was turn away. And that haunted him for many, many, many years. And the impact of that survival tactic had a huge impact on his ability to father his children and to find joy in his life. But, talked about resilience at the beginning, he also had a gift, and his gift was to be able to process and heal. And he is being able to work through, he's still working through, he's always working through and processing through, and he continues to do it. From writing my chapter, I learned keen insights into my own issues with numbing emotions but also a deeper understanding of how my father suffered, not only during the war but after, and how our resilience and courage in processing allowed our relationship to heal. Forgiveness is often a theme for survivors and their children. I don't understand how one forgives the Nazis for their purposeful choice to systemically exterminate 6 million individuals because they were Jewish. But my dad says he had to forgive them in order to move on with his life. Closer to the heart, though, was my dad's need to forgive himself for turning away from his father when they met for the last time in Buchenwald. In 2012, my dad was invited to the 66th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of Buchenwald. He brought his wife Jean, my brother Leon, and me to the spot where he likely met his father for the last time. We stood in a circle, arms around one another, and Sevek forgave himself, speaking aloud to his father. He said, "On this space of ground here, I'm thinking of the day we met in Buchenwald. I was embarrassed and disappointed that I didn't act as the loving son that I should have, and I'm sorry. But I know that you can feel that I am here with your grandchildren, Leon and Ruth. And I can see you smiling and can see how happy you are that I survived. You live in my spirit, and I loved you, and I'm sorry you didn't make it. I just want to tell you that I know that you're here with us, and I feel your presence. And we are here on this spot to tell you that we all love you very much." I am not a Holocaust survivor, but I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I didn't live the Holocaust, but I have lived the consequences, the abandonment, the anger, the blaming, and ultimately the unbelievable awe of survival. I love my dad, and I'm grateful that I am capable of loving him. Forgiveness starts with ourselves. So that kind of, thank you for listening to our excerpts, all of us. Sorry, Rita. It's been such a privilege to work with the other authors on this book, and I think we're going to do some Q&A, and Erin's going to help with that. Thanks.
So I made a few questions of my own, but let's start with the audience. Does anybody have any questions for one of the authors or all of them? Yes, sir.
Well, it's not so much a question. I probably speak for almost everybody when I say that the motivation or the impetus that you felt for writing the book and coming together and remembering in print was that you could speak for your parents and others who went through the Holocaust, and in that way keep that experience and memory alive. And I think I'll probably speak for everybody when I say that you succeeded in doing that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Well, maybe if I ask some questions, it might spark some things, some ideas. So I wanted to first just talk about the writing and the editing of the book, because if you haven't read it yet, the 4 editors also wrote excerpts or wrote stories in the book, but there's a plethora of other authors. So I hope that you take a book home with you tonight, because I think it's very interesting that there were so many shared experiences, but really some things that are very unique. So I wanted to talk first about how you spoke about when the reason or the impetus for this book was how you all were working on the Yom HaShoah commemorations. And so I don't know if before you had met each other and worked together on these events, did any of you or any of the authors express to you that you had considered writing a memoir by yourself? And if so, why didn't that happen? And why did maybe this make more sense?
I can go. So my aunt, who was the partisan fighter, and my mother sponsored her to come to Canada when she was 60 years old from communists, from the Iron Curtain, basically. And she wrote a book on the resistance during the war. And then she wanted to write another book about just a photo journal of our family, or, and so she asked me, actually, because she thought my English was so good and hers was not, whether I would be willing to write the foreword to her book by writing an intro on what it was like to be a child of a Holocaust survivor. And my mother had already passed at that time. My mother did not necessarily approve of my aunt's sort of going on the lecture circuit about the Holocaust as a resistance fighter. She had her own feelings that those who were in concentration camp were really the survivors. And my aunt, who was fighting in the woods, well, she had her own story, was not a true survivor in that sense. So she had asked me to write, a foreword on what that was like to grow up, and so I did, and that was, I think, in 2007 or 2008, and then I took a memoir class and expanded that 5-page version into kind of a 10-page version, and then the people in that memoir class had said to me, well, you have enough for a whole memoir. And then I started joining the group to do Yom HaShoah services, and just put that aside, and just felt that this was more powerful to be able to have a variety of stories, basically, about our experience in just one kind of life story. Anyway, that was my history of that.
I'll say my dad wrote his memoir in 2006, and I was amazed that at it with it, and but it's not something that would have ever occurred to me to do, because again it was like, well, he already wrote his story, and what's my story? I don't have a story. So again, it wasn't really until as the evolution of our services, we started to bring in more of our own perspectives, and then started to make some of those connections to our parents that I wanted to do this.
And my mother and aunt both had prose writing careers in English when they came to this country. They wrote short stories, they wrote 2 English language novels apiece. So they had a lot of opportunities to write their stories independently of my voice. I was in psychology graduate school when I stumbled across the literature on first and second generation effects of Nazi persecution. And this was in maybe 1977. I wrote a long scholarly paper about it. But I thought that the most important stories were those of the survivors, not of the second generation. And like many other 2Gs, I felt extraordinarily protective of my parents' feelings and was very reticent about airing any discomfort or displeasure or negative effects of growing up in the shadow of their experiences. So I would describe myself as a reluctant memoirist, but the process of doing the writing in the context of this group of people who had known each other since 2004, who grew to trust one another, who knew about a lot of these shared experiences privately. I think other than Rita and one other author, Fran Berg, who was working on a full-length memoir, I don't know that any of us would have been emboldened to write what we wrote outside of the context of our group, because our experiences and our voices and the emotional support amplified each of our stories vis-a-vis each other's stories.
Thank you. So there were there are lots of common threads in the book. amongst all of your experiences. But I wanted to see if you would comment on a few of them without maybe giving too much of the book away or getting too personal. So a few of the authors noted about, of course, the idea that trauma is handed down. In fact, in our DNA, there's been studies that show that, especially as it relates to Holocaust survivors and their children, and talking about their parents having gone to therapy or received treatment or not, and U.S. children also going through similar experiences. So I was wondering if you would comment on that, not necessarily within your own experience, but what you found as something very common amongst all of the writers.
I'll start. Can I start? Sure. Okay. So one of the things when we were starting to explore this idea of writing about our lives growing up with our parents, we were all together talking about, potentially doing this project. And somebody asked how many of us have had parents that have suffered from depression? And every hand went up. And we looked at each other, and then the next question was, how many of our parents have suffered from depression and been medicated or been hospitalized for it? And every hand went up. And we'd been together for a long time, and we just kind of looked at each other like, wow, there's something here. So I think that's one of those really, those common threads that have come through from that perspective. As far as our things, talk about that, like major commonalities between us from that experience.
From the experience of having our parents suffer in that kind of way.
Yeah.
I think the majority of us, I'll say, have struggled with anxiety to some to a greater degree than others, and that we could think of might be epigenetically, transferred. At the same time, I think all of us have an incredible amount of resilience and grit. We're all pretty successful, quote unquote, with that, according to Western cultures, standards are, and probably we're more driven maybe to achieve than might be some of the norms. If our parents survive, there must be a reason for that, right? And I think several of us also, in several of our families, our parents were quite overprotective of us. And, whether that's the typical Jewish mother, so to speak, or whether the concentration camp experience, really exacerbated that. All of a sudden you may be taken away, or, if you didn't call home when you got to a friend's house, kind of panic might set in, in the families. So that was pretty common amongst a lot of the survivors' children growing up. And I think also a sense of, belongingness, where do I fit? How do I really fit in? Because, you may be Jewish and you may even grow up in a community or a suburb where your friends are all Jewish, but you may be still only one or two of the people in the whole community who had survivor parents. And then you wondered, where do I fit into this?
I guess the only thing I would like to add is that fierce attachment to family, fierce loyalty to family, fierce devotion to family is a common thread hallmark, even though for some authors that came out sideways with a lot of anger and aggression in the parent-child relationships. We did not want to disappoint our parents. We were the social currency for them in terms of status and pride in a milieu where people who had been in this country for a generation or two or three were often much more established socially and financially and educationally, depending on when our parents' educations were interrupted by war. We are overrepresented in the helping professions. We are crawling with therapists in our group. So there's a lot of curiosity about what makes people tick, what makes people do awful things, and how to help other people heal from their traumas.
Yeah, I was curious, looking at the contributing authors, I see one name that suggests it's a male, but do you think there's a difference between men and women in this process?
Well, the two men that are in our, we're in our writing group are very, very sensitive men. And they found the writing process incredibly healing for their own relationships with their own fathers in particular. A lot of us have brothers who do not respond in the same way that we do to our parents' experience. Some brothers don't want to even talk about it. And some think you're living in the past. Why deal with that? So I think there is some difference, but I don't know how to generalize. And certainly some of the men here who are 2Gs might be able to speak to that. Joy,
Yeah, if I may, our group is predominantly female. And over the years, we tried to recruit men in our congregation that we knew were 2Gs, and those men typically declined. So I think there is a gender difference, very broadly speaking, not to oversimplify it, of a comfort facing those difficult feelings and talking about them in a group or talking about them in front of the congregation.
I mean, it is more typical, right? If there's any problem in a marriage, it's typically the woman who says, come on, let's go to therapy, let's deal with this. And it's the men who are more reluctant. They may engage once they're there, but often it's a struggle to try to get them there. So, yeah.
The two authors whose parents are still alive, how was it for those 2Gs to consider writing as they knew that their parents were going to read this? And what was the reaction after it was written?
Well, one of them would be me. I didn't think about it so much I wasn't really worried about my father reading it so much. As a matter of fact, when I told him what I was doing and that I wanted him to read it, he said no. And a couple times said no. And then he came around and said yes, he would read it. And then when he did that, I was like, oh, well, I don't want him to read it. And it was, because then at that point I realized, well, this could hurt his feelings. And I was really I would think I was more worried about that than I actually realized. And he did read it, and I remember talking to him on the phone, and he said, I said, so what did you think? And he said, well, he said it was beautiful, and I just, I said, did I hurt your feelings? He said, I'm too old. Yeah, I'm too old to have hurt feelings. I don't have enough time left in my life to have hurt feelings. And that was just, not the father that I grew up with, and it was just like this weight. I didn't even realize this weight was on my shoulders, and it was just this cloud just like really lifted off of me. And when I saw him one-on-one, we talked about it some more, and he said, and we talked a little bit, and he gave me a little bit more insight into why he parented the way he did. And then he said it was too painful for him to talk about further. And I said that, that's fine. And it's just really, so the process has really brought us closer together.
I would say that as watching Ruth work through her chapter, I think that it did work. You were worried when you were writing initially, like some things about her dad. And, so it got, as you do multiple drafts, things change. And I know that was there at the back of your mind. And certainly for Avishai, who's the other one whose parent is still alive, he also was, considering that, tempering it a little bit in terms of what he was writing. And when he did tell, he read his chapter actually to his mother. His mother, though, has a little bit of dementia. So he's not sure how much she actually processed, what it is that he said. And she just was very happy that he had, written something.
I think he was concerned about his siblings too, and they were really receptive about what he had written too, which made him feel better about his mom.
Yeah. And certainly for a lot of us, several of us said if our parents were still alive, we wouldn't have written what we wrote.
So talk about multiple drafts. How did you decide what to keep and what to not keep? I mean, that would be a long process as far as, and trying to have each chapter sort of similar in size and.
Right. So, yeah. So, we initially were going to write, as Ruth had shared earlier, take our parents' stories, some excerpts, and put that into a book without having like our reflections in it. And we had done this whole what we thought was creative prose, till one editor said, that she couldn't really follow it, and but she was wonderful. She was incredibly helpful to us. Spent an hour with us on the phones, suggesting different ways, and really was the one who encouraged us to go back and rewrite from our own perspective. So what was the trickiest part was because several of us were friends already in our group, and it's really hard when us four editors would then want to give suggestions to our colleagues or friends on, gee, how you can write this maybe a little bit better, or go deeper here, and we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and we were definitely wanted to include everybody in it. And so then we had another rough draft, and each of us editors took 3 or 4 authors and worked with them individually to shape that chapter. And then when we had some time, as we shipped our manuscript off to different publishers, we said, why don't we get like a real editor? Because we're not professional in that regard. And let's see what she has to say about our manuscripts. So we hired a developmental editor. And she worked with each of the authors to make their chapter more succinct and differentiate from one another. And that was really what really helped. And she could ask the questions that we couldn't ask, or that we did ask but weren't answered, of the authors, because there was a little bit of distance from it.
So the one aspect of that was, as our professional editor helped us zoom in on a unique theme or element that would help our chapter stand apart from the others, that involved putting aside huge swaths of text that didn't fit that new orientation. And the good news about that is that leaves a lot of raw material to work on in further writing, which I think very many of us, including myself, intend to do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Joy can hear me or not.
I can repeat it.
So, and I mean this question in a very respectful tone, but as children of survivors, who are the survivors, have to not only raise their children, but also process through their own trauma. And as a result, the children then have to figure out what belongs to them and what emotions have been inherited as a result of trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So naturally, there's going to be feelings of anger, grief. You might, as 2G children, you might be grieving in some ways the loss of a mysterious childhood that you saw other children having that you might not have had for yourself. So I was curious if any of you felt comfortable to elaborate on your process in first delineating what is my feeling versus what have I inherited from my parents, and then secondly, how do I deal with my own anger and grief in the world that basically you guys didn't really have a pear shake at a happy go-lucky childhood. You know, you came into a situation that wasn't your doing, right? If that makes sense. And again, I mean it in a highly respectful way.
Joy, did you hear that?
Sure. And I think I caught the gist. I do think that there's a common thread among many of us that, you know, this is the soup we were cooked in, basically. And it's difficult when you're in the midst of an experience as a child to make the differentiation that you're describing. Yes, on the one hand, you know, other kids had more freedom of movement than we did. We had to, you know, I was a New York City kid. I could ride the bus and the subway downtown and meet a friend. But she says to this day, you know, I had to find the nearest payphone outside of the Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue and let my mother know that I had met up with my friend and that I now had a buddy in my wanderings in the big city. There's a anecdote in my chapter about how when I went to college, what I say in the chapter, a scant 10 miles from home, my mother wanted to move closer. It actually turns out, I learned only in recent years, that it was only about 6 miles away. That kind of terror of differentiation was a big, big struggle for me as an adolescent, but not so much as a child. So I think, you know, many of us describe in our chapters, in spite of it all, we were our parents' treasures. We were adored. We were doted on. And we had, most of us, pretty normal childhoods. You know, we had Girl Scouts and summer camp and excelled in school and had friends and went on sleepover dates and had parties. So it's not a binary of either we were utterly deprived of the kinds of experiences that our American-born, you know, American peers had, but there was an undercurrent that was transmitted to us sometimes by osmosis, sometimes in fragments, that it's difficult for a young child to do the sense making. And a very important part of the writing process for us was to use the writing to make sense of that full mix of experiences and feelings, including anger and resentment. I mean, we were coming of age in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of opportunity to act out and be pissed off at American grown-ups, but we not to the same extent as our peers, for the most part. And the great beauty of writing our chapters when we're in our 60s and 70s, as opposed to our 20s and 30s, is that we too are too old to be angry and hurt about it. It's more of a reflective, meditative, healing look at the full arc of our life experience, with a lot more compassion for our parents and ourselves than we would have had 30 or 40 years ago. I hope that answers your question in part.
Well, the only thing I would say is there was because our families were so small, there was always, we always knew there was something kind of amiss, right? Because we didn't have most of us did not have grandparents. We didn't have cousins. And on Sundays, that's what American families do. They go visit the grandparents. And we didn't have that. Or in my particular family, we had a lot of survivor friends, and they didn't have children. And I didn't know why they didn't have children, right? Because of the war. It was just a general statement. And so you didn't really understand that. At the same time, there was this joie de vivre in my family, and in a couple of others, right? Of grabbing life, by its hand, by its the hand, and just in the moment. And there was just a lot of joy, and we were the apple of their eyes, right? And we were the dream that they couldn't have, to live it out basically for them.
Yeah, maybe not a common thread, but a common aspect is that all the authors were from the same synagogue.
Correct.
Right?
Yes, a Reform synagogue.
The book is written of the people of your synagogue or former synagogue, whatever the case is, and they've read it. What have been their comments to you about your book? Because they've known you for many years.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, they have been. So we're all from the same synagogue. but we're all transplants from across America and Canada and Europe, because Ann Arbor is a college town. A lot of us just stayed there. And so that's, so they don't have that long history of being in one place and knowing they didn't know our parents, for example. The community just embraced us. We did a book club with our 40 people in our temple intensive, like once every 2 weeks, where 3 of the authors came and shared their stories, and we discussed the book. And they felt privileged, to be able to listen, and felt it to be a sacred, experience. And we had a book launch with over 250 people, coming to the book launch that our congregation, our temple supported. So yeah, that was very well embraced. And one of the reasons we also wrote the book is because we saw the reactions that we were getting during our Yom HaShoah services. Our former cantor said that she feels that was the best service that is ever done every single year. And so we would have 150 people at least come to our Yom HaShoah services, and of course cry, but just loved it. So we felt emboldened kind of to write this book because of the response that they had. And they, we invited them, actually, Joy has this term, memory keepers, and we invited really our congregation to be the memory keepers with us of our stories.
Many of the 2Gs here, and maybe yourselves, have spouses, significant others, who are not children of Holocaust survivors. Mm-hmm. And how, or have you discussed this among yourself about, is there something that can be written about that relationship, and how does one incorporate having a spouse or significant other that is not a child of Holocaust survivors? Is there something?
Next book.
The next one.
Right, that'd be really interesting, right? Because we really have to interview those spouses, in a sense. What's your experience been like? I mean, they only have the N, well, not all of them, but they typically have the N of 1 only to compare in the relationship, right? But it'd be important to ask them, how has that relationship, what do they perceive of the relationship, or the impact of the Holocaust on the marital relationship? I know that our spouses who have been, have been very supportive of our writing the book, and they've read the book, they've been moved by the book. And even though they may know most of the stories that we personally have put in the book or reflections, there still was something new in there for them that they were moved by or realized. And this is after like 40 years of marriage, etc., for a lot of them.
There was a question over here.
I seem to recall from the book that, as was mentioned, that you were all from the same synagogue, and as becoming a part of that group was, for many of you, it seemed like kind of the first time you were really exploring that story of your parents and how it affected you. And I'm curious, you may have mentioned it in the book and I just don't remember it. Were any of you journalers before that point in time? And are any of your kids journalers now?
I mean, I've been kind of a journaler my whole life, so that's always been something I've done. I've never, but I've never written essay, anything like this before. And my son, actually, we had a point in our services where we invited our children to participate and write some things about their grandparents, and they even came and participated. So my son did write something and participated in that. And one of our authors, Nancy, her daughter, wrote this beautiful poem. She's written a beautiful poem about it. And we've got a legacy. Joy's daughter. So there's a real mix in the group.
I'd say about probably half of the group are journalers, I would say. And like in my case, I'm not a journaler, but all my 3 kids are journalers. But I like to write poetry, and I've taken classes and do writing, personal writing, when I feel moved to do it. So.
And I'm not a formal journaler, but I write epic letters to my friends. Used to be, and now it's emails, and I've archived them with the thought that they would make the bones of some memoir writing in the future.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and I'd like you all to answer it, even if you maybe have the same answer. We'll see. I think everybody here and most people in general can agree that the stories of Holocaust survivors are incredibly important, not only to be remembered and so that we remember their families who were victims of the Nazis, but also so that we can take them and learn to be better people, better citizens, and upstanders. And I'd like you each to comment about why you think the stories of the second generation are important. Of course, I believe they are, but I'd like to hear from your point of view why you think they're important, why people need to hear them, and why people need to reshare your stories.
You want to
Whoever wants to take it first.
I'll just say that I think that, well, number one, of course, there are Holocaust deniers out there, so you want them to be aware of the stories. For me personally, I feel like the incredible resilience that the gift of resilience that comes from trauma is important for people to know about and understand, and how healing can occur at any point in one's life. So it's a general kind of why I think that's important.
Yeah, I would say totally agree with that. And we didn't bear witness, but at least in my case, I feel an obligation though to provide Holocaust education and through the personal. And so for me to use the intergenerational lens in order to do that, to help educate on Holocaust, I can't walk in my dad's shoes, don't want to walk, think I don't have to walk in my dad's shoes, but in order for me to tell his story, it helps me to tell it in my story. And again, for those, especially kids, to listen to, know that, when you're growing up with trauma, that you can be resilient, that there is still joy. There's always, there's a balance there. It's not all bad. There's love in there too, but that you can shape things differently and understand and connect so that you can heal and move forward in your life and not be stuck.
So I agree with everything that Rita and Ruth said, and I would add that one way in which this is a mission-driven book is that, yes, resilience is inherited and transmitted across the generations, but so is the trauma. It has ripple effects. And we have too many people in our society who say the Holocaust was so long ago, it's just so over and it's not relevant. But we 2Gs are often the canaries in the coal mine, super sensitive to early warning signals and echoes of autocracy, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and neo-fascism. And we see those, we hear those echoes, and we hear them as alarm bells. And no, we were not the victims, the direct victims, but we inherited some of the ripple effects. And when we see similar horrors happening in the present day, when we see, for example, the devastation and destruction and atrocities in Ukraine, and we see what children are enduring with the resilience, with the picking themselves up and finding sanctuary and so on, it hurts my heart so much to know that the ripple effects of that horror will not be repaired in months or years. It will take generations. And we want to be a voice for being upstanders, to step up earlier, to intervene earlier, to prevent these atrocities from recurring in the future.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Ruth, Joy, and Rita. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to remind you that we have their book for sale. Ted will help you out with that over there. And, you know, I invite you all to come back. We have new exhibitions all the time. We just opened Dimensions in Testimony a few months ago with Mary Wygotsky, and now we have Holocaust survivor Helen Kahn in that, where you can have a real-time conversation with a Holocaust survivor who's, you know, home watching TV or something, but we'll be able to have those conversations for generations to come. So it's really important, and I hope you come back to check that out. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.